you very much. I'm so glad to be able to welcome everybody here today. I've had the great privilege of organizing this event with Catherine Ettman over the past year and a half, and I really have to thank our dean for his support, not only for this event, but also for his incredible interest in and commitment to this topic. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes because we have such diverse, gifted expert speakers that I want to allow them really to speak to you. They have come from as far away as Paris, California, Texas, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Providence, and really do represent such a wide range of disciplines. We're really lucky to have them all here with us today, and we're also lucky to have you. So I really appreciate that everyone has taken time out of their day. And want to mention that we also have a very sizable live stream audience watching today. So we have folks I know who are in Europe, Australia, around the world really, who are with us virtually today. And so we welcome everybody. I have two quick housekeeping notes and then just three quick little things I want to say. So first of all, bathrooms. If you went out past the registration desk and looked to the right, there are bathrooms there. We're also fortunate to have somebody here from the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center here today. This is Danielle, who can wave. We'll be seated there for the duration of today's event. If at any point you would like to talk to Danielle about anything, including the work of the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, please find her over there. A couple of other notes. So one is about language. Today we're going to be talking about commercial sex, and some people refer to that as sex work, some people call it prostitution, some people call it the sex trade, and for people who are a little bit newer to this issue, you may not know that sometimes just the selection of that word, what you call it when you talk about it, signals to people what your stance is on a particular policy issue. And I wanted to point out that because here today we have people from so many different disciplines, that the words sometimes are used in different ways across disciplines, also sometimes used to mean different things in Europe as compared to the US. So if you hear a word that isn't the one that you would have chosen, keep listening and see if you can listen to the substance of the argument of the person. I also wanted to clarify for people, especially because we're here in Massachusetts and our discussions about marijuana use the words decriminalization and legalization, but they use them the opposite of the way that we use them when we talk about commercial sex. So when we talk about commercial sex, the least restricted form would be decriminalization. On the other hand, legalization means that the government still has a hand in the mix. So the government would be regulating who sells sex, where, when, what are the regulations around it. So legalization is actually a little bit more restrictive than decriminalization, and I think you'll hear about both of those from some of our speakers. There's also something called the Nordic Model, which you may hear about today, which is when it is illegal to buy sex, but not illegal to sell sex. So two people in a transaction may actually have different legal consequences that they're facing. That's another model. So we'll be talking about all of these things. And one of the reasons why that's important to me in particular is because in putting together this event, I did have people who approached me who I think were trying to figure out, because this is has been historically a polarizing issue, a divisive issue, all right, what's the real agenda here? Like, which side are you on? Are you on the side of the abolitionists? Are you on the side of the sex worker rights groups? What's the real agenda here? And I can say with real authenticity, there isn't one. The School of Public Health, there wasn't a secret agenda. We're not trying to persuade everyone to think the same thing or to think a particular thing. For me anyway, I really do see that there's a spectrum of policy options, and that each one of those policy options has a spectrum of pros and cons for a spectrum of people, the buyers, sellers, their families, neighborhoods, communities, even the social services or law enforcement agencies. So I think if nothing else, what we are here today to promote is trying to take it all in and maybe advance the idea that within public health, adhering to just a one-size-fits-all answer could be a little bit more nuanced, and that we have a little bit more intellectual labor to do to sort out where we want to stand on some of these issues. So it's really an invitation to listen, take it all in, and not feel the pressure to come up with just only one answer if you don't want to. So I'll end there and introduce for you our first speaker today. Professor Barbara Brents is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She researches sex and gender in market culture. She's a co-author with Crystal Jackson and Catherine Corrigan of The State of Sex, Tourism, Sex, and Sin in the New American Heartland, a comprehensive study of Nevada's legal brothels, the only legal U.S. brothel industry. The work on prostitution regulation, political debates around prostitutions, the relationship between tourism, consumption, and sexuality, and the emotional and bodily labor of selling sex has been published in numerous scholarly publications. Brent's work has been featured in a wide variety of media, including the New York Times, Newsweek, Rolling Stone, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and the Wall Street Journal. She was named one of the 256 women who have made a difference in 100 years of Las Vegas history and has served on the National Board of the American Civil Liberties Union. Please welcome Professor Barbara Brents.
Thank you very much. I am truly honored to be kicking off this truly amazing symposium. And if I am followed by a number of some of the best speakers on this topic in the country, and I really want to applaud Emily and all the organizers for putting together, I think, what's going to be a super informative symposium on a really difficult topic, and I am looking forward to learning from everyone today, as I'm sure you all are. When I moved to University of Nevada, Las Vegas, now almost 30 years ago, Las Vegas kind of threw sexualized hedonistic consumption in my face. I also, though, at the same time began to notice that students in my classes were working in the sex industry. Neighbors who owned their own homes were also working in the sex industry. And it troubled the ways that I've thought about feminism and patriarchy, sexuality, and prostitution. Fast forward now and to today, and I've done research on Nevada's legal sex industry and its ties to the contemporary consumer economy. We completed a book on the brothels that Emily talked about. I'm currently conducting a large-scale survey of prostitution clients and pornography consumers that I'm in the middle of analyzing. And I've also been a part, as are a number of the speakers here today, of a huge growth in empirical academic research on sexual commerce. So I wanted to share what I've learned with you over the last 30 years and what it's taught me about regulating commercial sex. And my hope is that you can use all this in your work for public health and for reproductive and sexual justice. So my talk today is going to have two parts. First is this neoliberal context, because it's mostly men who buy and women who sell. There's an assumption that the sale of sex is primarily understood as gender inequality. That's certainly true, and a number of the speakers are going to deal with that today. I think what I'm going to throw out is that the majority of recent empirical research finds that there's much more to the story than that. So I'm going to explain the contemporary neoliberal political, economic, and social climate that complicates how gender inequality operates for different groups. And it makes what I believe in economic inequality super important for understanding the health and safety of those who sell sex. At the same time, it also makes selling sex more like other forms of work and consumption. Second, there are a wide variety of policy approaches used across the globe. Emily mentioned some of them: criminalization, decriminalization, legalization. The devil is in the details. Issues such as who, when, where, why is policy implemented? Who regulates it? Is it criminal justice institutions or is it business regulation? Is the goal to discourage commerce or to protect the rights of workers, or some combination of both? How is the policy funded? What are the associated services? So that passing a law can have little effect without an understanding of all of these kinds of issues. But the legal context does have some important consequences. So to help you see that today, I'm going to take you on a tour through Nevada's system of legalized prostitution. So let's begin. Since the 1970s, global politics has been driven by a belief in the fundamental rights of the individual. That is, individual responsibility, self-sufficiency, and the power of an unfettered, unregulated marketplace. Its politics promote free markets, low taxes, and deregulation across the globe. While neoliberalism is typically understood as an economic policy, it has three significant social effects. First, neoliberal ideas of individualism and self-sufficiency affect social relationships. They affect our values and our attitudes, including attitudes towards gender, sexuality, and individual rights. Second, neoliberal economic policies affect the nature of work and inequality. Finally, neoliberalism impacts government responses to inequality. Now, neoliberal politics has fueled and been fueled by the growth of a consumer economy. Consumption, not production, is the economic engine that drives the U.S. economy. Services, not manufacturing, is the economy's largest employer. Consumer values drive culture, sometimes in contradictory ways. Indeed, the freedom to consume what and where we want has become a large component in the neoliberal expression of entrepreneurial freedom and individual rights. The cherished value of free expression has driven more progressive attitudes towards gender equality and a tolerance of sexual diversity, as this slide from Marketing Las Vegas to the LGBT consumer shows. You can make money from marketing to sexually diverse groups. As consumers, we now demand experience, excitement, escape, relaxation, and self-improvement in a wide variety of services. We buy and sell core aspects of human relationships all the time. Emotions, connections, performances, touch. Like it or not, this is part of our culture. And a large body of research shows that the workers that work in these kinds of industries develop a variety of techniques to negotiate emotional and physical exchanges. In addition to this context, the very organization of work is changing. There's a greater use of part-time, subcontracted, or independent contractors as opposed to regular employees. And because increasing inequality is also so much a part of the neoliberal political economy, the underground and informal economy plays a much larger role than it does in the past in a variety of different contexts. Now, while the rhetoric of neoliberalism is a smaller state, policies have actually shifted government resources and functions from social welfare to criminal justice. The percentage of the population in jails and prisons has grown tremendously as tougher crime policies seek to control those newly disenfranchised populations. And with little else to help, criminal justice institutions have taken over the role of social services agencies in a lot of ways. Why and how people sell sex is a part of this economic and cultural context. The sex industry has grown to be a multi-billion-dollar industry. Businesses selling sexual services are getting more mainstream. This was down the street from a hotel I stayed in Vienna, and I think you can see stores like this propping up everywhere. Businesses like these tend to attract more diversity in social class, in age, in gender. This is a slide from the Las Vegas Adult Entertainment Expo. While it is still mostly women who sell, research shows that there's increasing diversity here as well. Men, boys, transgender individuals with various sexual orientations sell sex, and they each have unique, differing vulnerabilities. The Lancet, one of the top medical journals in the US and globally, published this sort of infographic that I'm not going to have up there long enough for you to see, but it points out that sex work is kind of a diverse field and that there are multiple ways that you might approach this in combating things like HIV and AIDS. Now, the experiences and resources of individuals who sell sex varies greatly by social class, by education, by a variety of different factors. One study in the UK of nearly 7,000 college students found that nearly 5% were working in the sex industry, with, interestingly, more men than women were involved in providing services. You can see, it's kind of light, but some of their motivations there varied. At the same time, prostitution continues as part of the underground economy. While research estimates street prostitution is only about 10% of all sex work, the most vulnerable face even more problems. Importantly, though, even among street youth, trafficking or coercion, while a serious problem, is not the biggest problem. There's been some good research that shows that few of these youth have been able to access the social services that they may need and want, and oftentimes have to identify traffickers, which they may be reluctant to do or may just not be relevant to their situation. Research on clients is difficult, but growing, and finding diversity in client markets as well. Recent studies find that clients seek things like mutuality, excitement, bounded relationships, sexual expertise. Indeed, one of the most coveted services among especially more wealthy clients are the girlfriend experience, which tends to be the most highly valued. At UNLV, we conducted a survey of 600 clients, an online survey. One thing that we did was to compare client attitudes about gender equality in the U.S. To the U.S. male population as a whole from the General Social Survey. While some of this data is still being analyzed, thus far we really find no evidence that, at least among the clients that we surveyed, the customers of prostitutes had no more negative attitudes towards women than did the rest of the population. Thus, some of the latest research is showing that context matters significantly to the health and safety of individuals who sell sex. Now, let's turn to what's going on in Nevada. Let's take a quick tour of at least one small market where prostitution is legal. Brothels are licensed in 10 of 16 counties of Nevada. Each county makes its own rules. Licenses are given only to existing businesses. County sheriffs or city police issue the licenses, do background checks, and monitor the health and safety at the brothels. Workers get work cards similar to workers in the casinos that requires background checks. I would say maybe 500 women have work cards at any one point in time in the entire state. Today's legal brothel industry exists in the context of huge population growth in the American West. In our book, we divide the brothels into two types, suburban and rural brothels. Suburban brothels exist around around Las Vegas down there at the tip and up around Reno and Carson City where the most population is. The rest of the state is extremely rural, and we call those that exist along these highways they're rural brothels. In many ways, these brothels are still similar to how they were in the past. Brothels tap into the same market for leisure and escape as in the small mining towns from which they emerged. Customers are migrants, miners, or seasonal workers in agriculture. Highways bring in truckers. These brothels market to traditional working class masculinity. Some market themselves as kind of a home away from home, grandma's living room kind of thing. They sell coffee, offer showers. Some play up the Wild West or some theme. Most of them have bars. They're usually a male-only environment, although there are women owners. While some brothels see more women as an increasing market, many of these small brothels, non-working women are usually not allowed in the brothel. This brothel in particular, outside of Las Vegas, experimented with bringing in male prostitutes but they were never very successful. It's just not part of the culture. What they sell is timed, categorized sex acts that last 30 minutes to an hour. The intercoms allow management to listen into the transaction for both worker safety and also to prevent theft. And when the party is over, when the timer goes off, management will knock on the door to let clients and the women know that their party's over, and if the men want to, they can renegotiate at that point, so it's not sort of on the women. State law requires that women take weekly and monthly tests for sexually transmitted infections. And, brothel practice is for women to conduct a dick check on customers prior to parties, which is a visual check for evidence of STIs. The women often train each other on what to look for. Women must take also monthly blood tests for HIV and syphilis. They give weekly cervical or urethral specimens for gonorrhea and chlamydia. And state law requires condoms for all sex acts. Zoning is strict and enforces very gendered notions about appropriate sexuality as being hidden and low-key. Advertising is illegal, except for these signs. It's oftentimes very informal management in these small brothels. The women are all independent contractors. They negotiate individual contracts with brothel management for however long they want to. They set their own prices. They do their own negotiations. And one of the most restrictive rules in these small brothels is that it's practiced to require women to live at the brothel while working, and rules on when they can go into town. Now, they blame that on the health requirements because you have to go, if you're gone more than 24 hours, you have to be retested. But in my view, that's one of the most problematic laws in these brothels, in some of them. Now, on the other hand, brothels close to the urban areas are bigger and capitalize on tourist markets. There are up to 50 women at a time working in some of these bigger brothels, as opposed to 2 or 3 at a time in the others. They're upscaling, mainstreaming, consolidating. This brothel, Sherry's Ranch, is in Nye County, just outside of Las Vegas. A few years ago, they brought by a set of investors who renovated with a clear purpose of mainstreaming. They changed the name of it from Sherry's Ranch to the Resort at Sherry's Ranch, with separate entrances, one for customers and one for a sports bar and restaurant that has big screen TV and a full menu, and the food's pretty good if you ever want to go there. They have a hotel that's, in addition, with separate 10-room non-brothel hotel where you can spend the night there. Say you spent the night at a brothel without purchasing sex. They've remodeled it to be fairly upscale. The women's rooms are off there to the right. Next door is a chicken ranch that is not quite as upscale. They recently remodeled their bar. You can see the gate there, and the practice is when customers come, they ring the bell. If you're providing services of some kind, like cleaning or whatever, you ring a different number so the women know not to come out. Their parlor is a little more masculine looking. This is the Wild Horse Resort up near Reno. It used to be called the Mustang Ranch. It's one of the newest ones. This is the owner. He's also a county commission member and owns a lot of property up there, of which the new Tesla Corporation also exists. All of these suburban brothels are designed to draw in a new kind of customer from the Old West, a middle-class male tourist who's experienced in buying leisure, seeking adventure, with different kinds of attitudes towards women. Indeed, they're even marketing to females, which is a small but growing population, mostly coming in with partners. They have the traditional lineup where men choose from a lineup of the women working as soon as they enter the brothel, but they also encourage women to work the bar. They also sell longer interactions, fantasy. They've put in these bungalows, private bungalows, which are themed. It's Roman Bacchanal, Middle Ages, sort of African safari, or the psychedelic 60s. Many of them also have dungeon rooms. The Wild Horse Ranch has a number of upscale rooms that are also themed. The king of consumer marketing is Dennis Hoff, who now owns 7 brothels in Nevada. This is the Moonlight Bunny Ranch, which is in Lyon County outside of Carson City in the Lake Tahoe, Reno area. Hoff sees his brothels as a sexualized fantasy land where you can sleep with your dream porn star, really anticipating this neoliberal product of experience and adventure. Unlike owners, Hoff seeks publicity. He had an HBO reality TV show. He recently published a book. Several of the women that work for him also have their own websites and have their own marketing plans. He tends to draw in much more upscale workers. And in an even crazier attempt to market fantasy and experience, Dennis Hoff recently brought a brothel about 90 minutes north of Las Vegas and themed and renamed it the Alien Cat House after Area 51, where the U.S. government supposedly stores alien spacecraft. It's licensed for only 5 workers, but you can see they have a separate negotiation room, so they don't negotiate in their room. Brothels have pools. This is the chicken ranch pool that the women usually use it more often than do the customers during a party. They also have a workout room for the women. They have a nice kitchen. They can go eat as much food as they want. The suburban brothels also have more rationalized bureaucratic work rules. Here's a brothel contract that I'm going to flip through too fast for you to read, but it contains the questionnaire for the sheriff card, a lease agreement, taxpayer identification card. The lease agreement, they pay a nominal fee for room and board, and then they share 50% of their profits with the brothel. They agree to solicit when they agree to solicit customers only on the premises. They agree to provide their own supplies. They agree to all the health checks. And Dennis Hoff's brothels have a non-compete agreement where you can't work at another brothel for a year, up to a year after you stop working at his brothel. Most of the women work at a brothel contract for 2 to 3 weeks at a time, but it can vary. A lot of women just work on the weekends. They also have their websites. So one important question is what brings women to these brothels? Their paths to the brothel as well, I believe, reflect the changing nature of contemporary work. We interviewed nearly 50 workers, and recent interviews show that this is a pretty similar pattern. They ranged in age from 19 to 55. Most of them were in their late 20s or 30s. Most of them were heterosexual, though a few identified as bisexual. Most of them were white. Half of them were married or in some sort of long-term relationship. 3/4 of them had children. 2/3 were educated beyond high school. The average age when they started working in prostitution was age 25. 1/3 of them came in primarily from non-sexual jobs in the low-paying service industry prior to coming to the brothel. One stated reason that they came to the brothel was because they couldn't make enough money to survive. They had some sort of a crisis and needed money for a sick child. One woman needed $1,000 to put an autistic kid in a drug trial. One woman lost her house in a mudslide. This quote's from a woman who worked in the healthcare industry as a single mom and came to work there on the weekends to earn enough money to buy a house. About 1/3 of them came from, and this is the service industry, a little more than 1/3, the legal industry a little less than 1/3. Some of them came from the legal sex industry where they had working in adult video or erotic dance. These women tended to have the most resources and most education. They were more likely to have their own websites, to have a film or a dance career that they could turn into in between their stints in the brothels. They referred to their sex work as a career path. And then about a third of them came from illegal sex work. Many of these had fewer resources. They were from lower income families. They told us that they turned to sex work because the money was much better than straight jobs. They came to the brothels as a break from the hassle of illegal work, safety routine, predictability from the legal risks. A minority of these reported that they had pimps. Management, however, hated pimps because they see them as a distraction for the women while they were working and discourages that. Some women reported that working legally in the brothels allowed them to escape aggressive pimps or switch to others if they wanted. Now, there was crossover in these three groups, but importantly, we found in the brothels no evidence of trafficking or no evidence of being forced to work there against their will. Another question that I get is, how do women interpret the work, the selling of sex? Some said that they did the work, what they did at work was not real sex. This is just my job, something very different than the special sex that they saved for partners. Some talked about the sex as a skill, like dancing. As this woman said, it's like choreographing a dance in bed. Others downplayed the whole sex aspect of it and talked about the emotional labor that they did. This woman who had been at Angel's Ladies for about 9 months maintained that you've got to feel your customers because all they need is sometimes to be touched and held. And many of them have reported to us that sometimes guys come in there and don't even want sex. They just want affection. But then there were those, about a third of them, who talked about sex as a sort of combination of the body and the mind, a sensual experience that engages all of these things for both themselves and for the client. They tended to be the workers who had were the highest earners, who had the most resources. They tended to be the most educated or thoughtful about their work. I won't read these. You can see them for yourself. So, in conclusion, in neoliberal times, like it or not, we buy and sell all sorts of bodily services and human emotions, and sexual commerce as a whole is but one part of this. There is a huge range in how, where, and why sex is sold. There's improved conditions for those with resources or who can take advantages of the upper class markets, but there are few resources for those at the economic margins. In this context, criminalization, I believe, from what I have seen, does not work. These policy approaches tend to focus on punishment rather than helping the workers. They blame individuals for large-scale social problems. They erase social class and often ignores attention to social services. I would argue that even policies that criminalize clients are still oriented to suppressing sexual commerce and put scarce resources into policing and punishment. They may get good clients to quit, but the most vulnerable will remain vulnerable. And for the most vulnerable, prostitution is largely a problem of resources. So, oops, that was what I was supposed to show when I said that. So what do we do? I've taken you on a tour of what a very small market of legal sex looks like, how they experience sex as work, how it's similar to them and to experiences in other interactive service jobs. This model works well in these small rural communities, but Nevada's model is not for everyone. Research on the variety of approaches throughout the globe tell us that the right policy mix must be based on evidence-based research, including the local context. Certain elements may work in certain areas and not in others. We have to involve sex workers or those who sell commercial sex in the design, steering, and evaluation of services and policy. And we have to include individuals from a wide variety of markets. We don't want to write policies that will backfire without a knowledge of how the industry actually works. In the absence of any change to the broader legal framework, certainly what we can do as public health servants is to emphasize safer working environments, access to care, and respect for rights. Whatever policy we have needs to be accompanied by other supportive policies to reduce structural inequalities and injustices. More research is needed to understand how criminalization and other structural inequalities ultimately impact worker health and safety. And this is just the last little excerpt from a special issue of The Lancet, which is this medical journal that you all might want to take a look at. And there you go. So, yeah, so questions is the best part. I'm sorry I blabbed on so long, but please, questions. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for that talk. I don't know what my opinion is, so I need help in thinking thinking that through. If the work is primarily being done by women, what does that tell us? Is it just that is it just a free market and we let the free market go and we can make it work like this, or does it mean that there's there's a fundamental problem that we need to do something about in society? And sorry for not framing the question very well, but it just brings up so much, and I'm sure this is what we're going to be talking about today, but thanks for any thoughts.
Yes, thank you for that question. I don't think a free market, historically, for anything, the free market tends to benefit those who have and punishes those who have not. So the trick is to find the kinds of regulations that empower those at the bottom to be able to access the resources that they need. I believe that we can't criminalize just the clients because that doesn't provide resources for those who most at the bottom of the thing, and it tends to, and unfortunately, as with most, look at the people who are in jail, it's mostly poor people and people of color, and that's who gets the problem in these sorts of things. I think even today, certainly with all the attention to the sexual harassment that's going on, and I'm so thankful that today the outcry against that is so strong, and it shows us that the battle for gender equality is not over, but it's certainly come a long way than it has when I started my career 30 years ago. But I think that one thing that we know regarding sexual harassment is that it is the power of the individuals to fight against the problems that they're facing. And you can't legislate guys and say, don't talk to women, that won't work. But so my belief is that if you empower individuals to be able to fight back and access resources and provide resources to the poorest and the most vulnerable, that's going to be the way to deal with this, not just a free market, anything goes. Yeah.
I think there's in the non-academic world, a general assumption that most of the women that work at these places or in the sex industry were abused as kids or have a troubled past. Is that your experience?
In my experience, we didn't ask questions about their past. They volunteered that, and the individuals that came from the illegal sex industry tended to talk more about troubled childhoods and problematic pasts. From my experience in talking to a wide variety of sex workers from a wide variety of social classes, that's not what divides people who choose sex work over those who don't. You do choose sex work because you've got some ideas about your own sexuality. Some of those can be positive ones, and some of them can be not so positive ones. I think for most anybody going into any job, you got to think about your own personality and what your past is and what that's going to give you. But again, I think that that reflects this resource differential among people in that industry as in any other job. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Hi, thank you for your talk. I have a question about the public health implications of how brothels are organized. So you mentioned a lot of the testing regimes, and my understanding is that some of those testing regimes actually, they seem quite punitive. They don't actually seem grounded in evidence themselves. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, correct. Gender inequality operates. It's the women working who are tested, not the customers. And I think most people agree that the biggest thing that has prevented the spread of disease through those brothels is the mandatory condoms. It's been politically useful for the brothels to exist because they can appeal to, see, we test these women, the women are safe, and therefore it's safe for everybody. If I had my way, I would certainly revamp that system. You all probably know best how that might be done. But it's really, most people agree it's the use of condoms that does the most. And yeah. Okay, one more question. Who wants to be the last one? I think I just suppressed everybody with that one. Yeah.
With new medications like PrEP in the market nowadays, how is this changing the condom policy?
Well, you're talking to a sociologist who doesn't know that. So I can't answer that. So I hope to learn about that. If we can take another quick question. Sorry about that.
Hi, you didn't really address the risk of violence for these women. Can you talk a little bit about, is there elevated risk of violence for these women? How is that managed within the workspace?
Yeah, we talked to the women about this, and there was only one woman among all the ones that we talked to that talked about any example of violence that she experienced. She was the only one that mentioned it, but about themselves or about anybody else. What works to protect these women is the fact that you're in a house full of other people, that the clients have to go up there and are vetted, that you go through a negotiation process that's monitored at some point. So if you get a clue that something's off, you can 86 them, you can walk them. There's also many of them have panic buttons in the room, although some of the women say sometimes, depending on where they are, they can be unhelpful or not. The woman who's described violence that she experienced, she said that the other women kind of noticed this guy coming in, and their sort of radar went up, and so when she started kicking and making noise, they were in that room really quickly. Because they heard scuffling going on that wasn't typical. So in all, these brothels are very safe in terms of violence from clients, and they're also pretty, the police are there to protect them so that managers can call police if a client is too drunk or out of control. So at least violence against women is not the biggest problem in that setting. Thank you very much. I look forward to the rest of the day.
Okay. So thank you very much, and I'd like to introduce our next speaker. We're moving now from the U.S. to global perspective, and I would like to welcome Gülser Corat. She's the director of the Division of Gender Equality in the Office of the Director General at the Unesco headquarters in Paris. She was a pioneer in making gender equality a priority at UNESCO and has been with the organization since September of 2004. She has a wealth of experience in academia, international development, and the private sector, and is also a TEDx speaker. She has lived, worked, and managed projects in more than 30 countries in Asia Pacific, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and South America, Europe, and North America. So, welcome.
Oh, perfect. So good morning, everybody. I would like to start by thanking Professor Rothman and Professor Galea, Dean of the School of Public Health at Boston University, and their teams, which was the way that made possible for me to come here during a very busy period in my organization. I will talk about a different context. I will talk about the international context. And in that context, I will focus more on those who go into this area because of coercion and force. So it will be very difficult from, very different from what we heard so far from Barbara. I also want to make two caveats. First of all, everything that Emily said in the beginning about the use of terminology, please accept my apologies in advance. This is not an area we work on at UNESCO, so this was a learning experience for me. I did a lot of research to prepare for this conference, so I will use terms interchangeably without putting any meaning on them in terms of where I stand, because UNESCO doesn't have a stand on this issue. And the other thing I want to apologize for is my focus will be on girls and women. I would have really wished to talk, also to be able to talk more about the LGBT sex workers and their challenges. But this is an area where it's very difficult to find data and information, and it's even more difficult for that group. So both because of the focus of my work at UNESCO, which is gender equality, and also because of the existence of data, I will focus more on girls and women in this context. So I'm very happy to be here at this symposium. It's a very timely discussion, very important discussion, and I really look forward to learning from all the experts who know much more about this topic than I do. I don't know if you follow what Angelina Jolie does, but you know, she talked to a group of United Nations peacekeeping officials a few days ago, and this was a conversation about ending sexual violence, especially in conflict situations. And she asked for, she's an advocate and an ambassador for that purpose for the UN. So she talked to the peacekeeping officials, and she said, and I quote her, sexual violence has nothing to do with sex and everything to do with power. While the topic of today's conference differs in many respects from this kind of sexual violence and assault, I want to use some of the underlying assumptions that Angelina Jolie referred to. Because we believe that at the core of this issue and that of commercial sex, viewed from a global perspective, and as Jolie explained, women's equality and our full human rights are at stake. So these are issues about power from where we stand. These are issues about inequality, and these are issues about human rights. And this is especially clear when we look at this issue from the perspective of the individuals who are involved in commercial sex, not the ones in Nevada, but the ones in the global context. Let me give you an example. A recent documentary which I watched to prepare for this conference tells the stories of women and girls who work on the ironically named Road of Love in Italy. This is a 9-mile road along the Adriatic coast of Italy where people work in the sex industry. The film tells the stories of an increasing number of young Nigerian women who are trafficked into the sex industry and who end up here. Many leave home with other ideas. They want to reach Europe to find employment, to be able to make money so they can send money back to their families at home. But when they arrive, what happens is a different story. They usually find themselves indebted to people who bring them, who help them bring them here. And of course, this is a very difficult journey that they face. I don't know if you watch television about the thousands who drown in the Mediterranean almost on a monthly basis because they try to come to Europe via really bad, not safe boats from Libya, and there's a lot of trafficking in that along that route. So they arrive in Europe already indebted to the people who helped them come here, and just paying of this debt of the journey can take several years of sex work. And during this time, they are tied to the people who bring them here and who keep them there along the love road, and they are highly vulnerable to violence and abuse, again, unlike the situation we heard in Nevada. But what is really more scary is the fact that most of these young girls and women are underage. Just this morning, I received another message from the UN research group. It refers to another research just conducted by the International Organization of Migration, which says that half of the girls who are trafficked and half of the girls who end up in sex trade are encouraged by their families. Not because the families are sending them to become sex workers, but families think that when they will have education and employment opportunities. So it's a very, very difficult situation at the global level. There was one woman in the documentary called Jessica, who worked as a sex worker, but who then managed to get out, and she now works with an NGO, non-governmental organization, to protect the women and girls from violence and to help them move to a safe house. And what is really interesting for me, coming from Unesco, which is a United Nations specialized agency focusing on education, among other topics, the first thing they do at the safe house is to provide opportunities for education for these girls and women. So I will keep referring to education, and I will ask for your indulgence because I represent UNESCO. I will be remiss if I don't talk about education and the importance of education as almost like a silver bullet for many of the problems. The film, I used the film because the film made 3 points that I will try to elaborate on. First, it is essential to view commercial sex in a global context from a human rights perspective. It's all too often tied up with human rights abuses. Those involved are more vulnerable before and after their involvement in commercial sex. When empowered, usually through the help of education, as the documentary mentions, to make a different choice, many of these women do make a different choice. The second element, which was also in the documentary, is it's essential to view commercial sex from a gender equality perspective. In places like the Road of Love in Italy, it is impossible to understand the vulnerability and threat to these women and girls without taking gender into account. And this means attending to both the gender dynamics in their country of origin, but also those that drive the sex industry in the destination country. The third element, the role played by the media and journalism in portraying sex workers responsibly, is key to advancing policy debates at the international level in a way that supports this human rights-based agenda. Media and journalism is also important, again, from a UNESCO perspective, because it's one of the 5 areas of specialization that we have, and we do work a lot on media, and we work a lot with journalists, not only for safety of journalists, which is also a very important issue, but also to train media outlets and journalists to report in a gender responsible manner, and it's a more difficult job than you can imagine. So while there are conflicting and multiple perspectives on the issue of gender equality and commercial sex, I hope that some common ground can be found by taking an approach that is guided by human rights. So through the experiences I put forward from this global perspective, I hope to provide not an answer, because I don't have an answer, but some food for thought to advance the policy environment of sex workers from a human rights perspective. Now, the values of human rights and gender equality are entrenched in multiple agreements that have been endorsed by the international community. I will not mention all of them, but let me mention the most recent one, which happened in September 2015 here in the United States, in New York, when over 180 countries, the leaders of 180 countries met and agreed on what we call in the UN system the Sustainable Development Agenda, or Agenda 2030, which has 17 sustainable development goals. What is interesting about this agreement, in the past, most of the international agreements on development, international development, applied more to the developing countries, but this time, as a new element in the Sustainable Development Agenda, it applies to all, even the most industrialized and most developed countries, and countries are expected to take ownership of these 17 goals, and the UN and other organizations are supposed to accompany the countries in their quest to reach these goals. Why this is important? This Sustainable Development Agenda has 3 goals that are really critical for gender equality. Goal number 3, which is about sexual and reproductive health and rights, and maternal mortality, which is an area where we are witnessing a lot of political setbacks, even in this country. The second is Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is about inclusive and quality education. And in that goal, almost every target addresses one question or another about gender inequalities. And the fifth goal, Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is exclusively about gender equality and girls' and women's empowerment, which adds to the other existing other goals and their gender equality components, but also focuses on very specific elements of gender inequalities. One of the targets of this goal, number 5, involves eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. So I wanted to really mention that goal very specifically. Now, I did mention UNESCO as my organization. Just allow me to give you in a few words what it does, what it's all about. It was established in 1945 at the end of the Second World War in Europe, in order to prevent any other incident like the Second World War to happen ever again. And its motto is building defenses of peace in the minds of women and men, since wars start in the minds of women and men. Initially, it was only men. We added women. I think we could do without women in the war part, but maybe it's important to build the defenses of peace in everybody's minds. And we work in 5 areas, as I mentioned: education, communication and information, which is about media. But we also work on the natural sciences, social and human sciences, and you probably know us best through our cultural heritage sites. UNESCO works on culture, and we have more than 1,000 sites around the world, and there are some here in the United States. The one that I remember very quickly is the Grand Canyon, which are on this list. What is interesting for UNESCO is that we made gender equality one of our global priorities, one of 2 global priorities in 2008, and it will remain a global priority until the end of 2021, and I expect it to be renewed after that again, because Agenda 2030 takes us up to 2030. And it provides a common thread, a red thread, and our multi-sectoral and humanist approach allow us to tackle issues related to gender equality from different perspectives in a way that exploits the synergies among these different domains of action. That's why I'm going to talk more about education and the media in my presentation. For the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to look at some of the drivers for entering sex work. And there are many factors, but the ones that I want to highlight are poverty, indebtedness, low level of education, low levels of work opportunities, abuse, drug use, and most importantly, from an international organization perspective, humanitarian emergencies and post-conflict situations. The documents or organizations within the UN system that work more directly on these issues, on HIV and AIDS, exploitation, trafficking, migration, they also cite gender inequality as a key driver specifically, but I would argue that gender inequality is part of all other drivers as well, so I don't think we need to separate it from the others. Now, as I mentioned, one of the key drivers, one of the key means of overcoming the drivers of sex work in the way that we think at UNESCO is education. Because we think that education is not just about gaining academic skills. It is not just about learning how to read and write and to know about certain subjects. In our approach, education is holistic, and it encompasses life skills that are needed to empower the next generation of global citizens. So part of this education is to ensure that people have the knowledge and skills necessary to make conscious, healthy, and respectful choices, including about their relationships and their sexuality. Research has demonstrated that educating young people in this way favors safe sexual behavior, delays sexual debut, and increases the use of contraception. One of our most controversial programs is called Comprehensive Sexuality Education, and it is about all those things, teaching people at different age groups in an age-appropriate way, in a culturally appropriate way, about their sexuality and sexual and reproductive rights and health. And this is a program that comes under attack the most, and it's one of the reasons why the United States has stopped paying its dues to UNESCO, just a side piece of information. But we believe that it's very important to make sure that people know about their sexuality and their rights. And we have several programs that focus on girls and women's education. I will not mention them because I don't want to give you too many details, but I'll be happy to provide more information on some of the education programs that focus specifically on women and girls. Allow me just to say one thing. We have made a conscious choice to focus on 2 elements in the education cycle, more than others when it comes to girls and women. One is secondary education, because in the developing world, we find that our research shows that we lose a lot of girls in the transition from primary education to secondary education, because now in many countries primary education is mandatory and free. So girls do go through that cycle. But when it comes to secondary education, either they don't transition at all, or they drop out progressively as they move up the secondary education levels. It's a problem because secondary education is the place where you start learning about yourself, your rights, gaining confidence, and it's very important for empowerment and for instilling this idea of gender equality. So it's a loss from that side, but it's also a big loss because then you end up with generations of young women who become adult women who lose their functional capacities for reading, writing, and other things. And also it affects, as you know, educate a woman, you educate a village or a community. So when women are less educated in different phases of their life cycle, it has really serious effects on communities and societies as a whole. And the other thing we focus on is illiteracy, because there are today, it's hard to believe, but as we sit and speak here, there are about 800 million adult illiterates in the world. Is it 3 times the population of the United States, or 2.5 times the population of the United States? And a majority of them, 2/3 of them, are women. So the other fact, which is very shocking for us, is that this percentage, 2/3 women among the adult illiterate population, it hasn't changed in the last 20 years, even though many NGOs and all international organizations are working on providing literacy programs. So obviously we are doing something wrong. And I think that what we are not taking into full consideration is the gender dynamics of the programs that we prepare. So we're not reaching the groups that we are supposed to reach. Why did I mention UNESCO and education? I wanted to give you an example. We have a project in one of the most difficult countries at the moment in the world, Somalia. I'm sure you follow some of the things that are happening in Somalia through television and print media. We had a project there supported by the Ministry of Education of the country where we tried to bring together young women who were dropouts or who never had the chance to go to a formal school setting. We brought them together and provided them with learning literacy and life skills. And there was one woman I talked to in person. Her name was Fardosa. She was an orphan. She was in a very vulnerable situation, very likely to fall prey to trafficking groups or slavery, because that exists in many parts of the world today. But because she was able to participate in this program offered by UNESCO, she really developed a lot of skills and also confidence, to the point that her extended family entrusted her now with running the family business. And when I talked to her, she told me about some of the perils that existed for her if she had not had this chance. And one of them was trafficking and becoming forced into sexual labor. This situation we see a lot in humanitarian emergencies and conflict and post-conflict situations. And this is where we really started thinking about trafficking and sexual slavery, because it's happening more and more as there are more and more humanitarian emergencies and conflict situations around the globe. One thing that was really shocking to me, because I was already at UNESCO at that time, when the tsunami happened in 2005, and I think many of you will remember that, affecting mostly Southeast Asian countries. Of course, as the UN, all UN agencies were asked to come together and prepare an emergency package. What we found out was really scary. The first people who were able to get to the tsunami-affected areas were not aid workers, were not the UN, were not anybody but people involved in human trafficking. So these people, these networks, really prey on these situations, and they take advantage. One of the things that the UN decided to do, and Unesco was the agency that implemented it, was to establish community radios. We do have a system to do that at UNESCO within our communication and information program. We always had those community radio programs, but what we did this time, after the learning from the tsunami experience, was to include messages about being, warning people affected by these emergencies to be on the lookout for this kind of harmful effects of people who come to help you, supposedly. I don't know to what extent it reaches all the intended audiences, but it's little something that we can do, and we continue to do with the hope that it will reach at least some target audiences. And what we find is that, in terms of this incredible increase in the incident of human trafficking and sex slavery, is that there's first a huge demand for cheap labor everywhere in the world, and there's a new demand from the globalized sex industry. And this is everywhere, including in Western and Central Europe, which normally we would think would be the unlikely places. But in fact, Western and Central Europe have become the center of human trafficking and sex slavery. And as of 2014, according to a study by the European Parliament, human trafficking for sexual exploitation was one of the most lucrative illicit businesses in Europe, allowing criminal groups engaged in this activity to make around $3 billion a year. So, I mean, you were talking about the economics of the commercial sex in Nevada. It's everywhere. It is incredibly big amount of money. It's more money than these criminal groups make in some other areas of activity. So what we see in Europe, unfortunately, also is the groups that are supposed to put a stop to it are part of the criminal activity. Of course, it's not proven, but you can see, when you see, I don't know if I came from Paris, but when you go to Paris these days, you will see these trafficked people at every corner, even in the most affluent neighborhoods, right by the big historical sites that you normally go to visit when you're in Paris. And the police and the gendarme are walking by, and nobody does anything. Nobody, they just sit there in these very well choreographed settings, begging. The ones that we see are begging for money, but then there are all those who are also involved in sex trade. And in addition to this sex part of this trafficking, the International Labor Organization has also been looking at this issue, because this trafficking and related activities has also resulted in the worst form of child labor at the moment, which is also escaping all legal interventions. Let me go back to gender equality, because I said I will always use gender equality, human rights as the frame of reference. Of course, how people experience trafficking or sex work is highly gendered. And human trafficking is not left untouched by gender inequality. Even though this is an area where the numbers are not reliable, because you can't really get reliable data, so the actual situation is probably much worse than what we know. But we do know that women are at greater risk, because with the data that we have, it is evident that women and girls make up 71% of the estimated 40.3 million people who were trafficking victims in only 2016. So these are really staggering figures. 1/3 of the victims, 1/3 of the 40 million, are children, these underage people. And according, again, to the International Labour Organization, in 2016, 99% of human trafficking victims in the commercial sex industry were women and girls. So these are some of the numbers that we have. Again, based on research, a shocking 21% of victims, 21% of victims forced into commercial sex exploitation were children. Just incredible numbers. This means that an estimated 1 million children were coerced into the sex industry in 2016. That makes approximately 4.8 million victims, with the women and children coerced into commercial sexual exploitation. Just to put it into a reference framework that would resonate with this group, I compared it to the population of the city of Boston. It's roughly 7 times the population of Boston. As I mentioned, it's extremely difficult to measure these figures, but what we have is already very scary. I won't go into the details about natural and human-made disasters, but the picture we have is very similar. I already mentioned the aftermath of the tsunami. And I also want to skip some of the other things because I see that I'm running out of time. Let me move to the public health perspective, since we are at the School of Public Health. Now, there are many risk factors to the lives and health of sex workers, and a key risk faced by sex workers is, of course, related to their health. This is both because they are more likely to be exposed to threats to their health, such as HIV, and also because they are less likely to have access to health services. I just want to make the point that Barbara mentioned that in Nevada, the mandatory use of condoms is actually helping fight some of the sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV. It's not the case for these trafficking rings and women and children who are forced into commercial sex in other parts of the world, because one of the things about their vulnerability is the clients do not want to use condoms. If they don't want to use condoms, they are not forced into using condoms. So it's really a very important issue. And again, based on numbers we have, and this is, I will quote Lancet also because it provides the best information. More than 50% of sex workers living with HIV are in sub-Saharan Africa, which is an area really affected by this terrible infection. And 92% of all HIV and AIDS deaths attributed to sex work occur among African women. So it's something that is affecting that part of the world very, very badly. All this is to say that cultural and social, as well as political, legal, and economic settings shape the risk that these people face. In a very important report that was published by the UN last year or the year before, Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, evoked the necessity of repealing laws that criminalize commercial sex, going back to our topic, in order to facilitate access to health services, as well as the prevention of rape, violence, and harassment. An epidemiologist writing for The Lancet has argued that decriminalizing commercial sex work would have the greatest effect on the course of the HIV epidemics across all settings, averting 33 to 46% of HIV cases in the next decade. These are really very important figures and evidence. Now, I have to admit more work is needed to understand the injustices and the inequalities that make these women and girls and children particularly vulnerable, and to provide them with the health care they deserve. But we also know that finding solutions is urgent. And in the cases that I mentioned, like Africa and some of the things that are happening in our backyard in Europe, it's not the least because HIV is also a driver of trafficking. One of our reports, one of UNESCO reports exploring the causes of trafficking in Nigeria, found that AIDS orphans are particularly vulnerable to being trafficked. So it creates a vicious cycle of trafficking victims. A common theme of my presentation, as I warned you at the outset, has been the role played by gender inequalities in making sex workers more vulnerable. Gender shapes whether a person enters sex work in the first place, and whether by free choice or by coercion. It also shapes a worker's experience of their profession, making them more prone, in some cases, to violence and abuse. In many cases, the intersectionality of different factors exacerbates this vulnerability. I wanted to talk before about the Rohingya refugees. Again, this was related to natural and person-made disasters. You probably are reading about what's happening in the refugee camps for the Rohingya refugees. There, almost 1 out of every 2 women and children is experiencing sexual exploitation, and the international community is at a loss about what to do. And we have become so used to hearing these things that we just compare it to another refugee situation in the recent years, and try to find solace in the numbers that decrease or increase. But let me go back to this issue of gender equality. Since we are in the School of Public Health, it is very much a public health issue. Therefore, to work on gender equality and women's empowerment is also to work towards improved public health and the next HIV-free generation. We work as UNESCO on this in multiple ways. I did mention the work on media and journalists, so I won't go back into that. But I want to conclude with something on education, if you allow me. A few days ago, on the 25th of November, we commemorated the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. This is a UN International Day that is acknowledged and marked in many countries. In relation to this day, many articles appeared in the press that spoke about sex work, sexual exploitation, and trafficking. They spoke about the vulnerability and threat to women, often because they are women and because they are women in circumstances beyond their control. Educating women, ensuring that they are safe and can live lives free of violence, will, to some extent, restore their agency and enable them to regain some control. So rather like the Somali woman I mentioned, who learned vital skills that gave her a different prospect, some of these women who are already victims of trafficking can find brighter, healthier future. While this is a very controversial issue, from a human rights perspective, it is possible to find some common ground from which to start the debate. Malala Yousafzai, some of you may remember her. This was the young Pakistani girl who was shot by the Taliban because she wanted to go to school. Rather than seeking darkness, she moved towards the light. We work with her all the time. We have a fund at UNESCO called the Malala Fund for the Education of Girls. She said, we should all consider each other as human beings, and we should respect each other. She dedicated her second life in collaboration with UNESCO and with some other UN agencies to promote education for girls and has been very outspoken about the benefits of education. I would like to quote her. She says, "Let us pick up our books and our pens. They are our most powerful weapons. One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world." So that's what we try to do at UNESCO, and I thank you very much for this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the topic of today's discussion, but also about UNESCO's work. Thank you very much. And I only have time for one or two very short questions. Yes, please. So there are two here.
Points. Why did the U.S. sign up for, and have you ever been sued, the UNESCO ever been sued by a country that you were supposed to go and protect refugees, women and children, but didn't, and or the family had sued UNESCO?
If I understood correctly, you're asking why the U.S.
Yeah, there's 2 points. Why didn't the U.S. sign up for the UNESCO program? And have UNESCO ever been sued? Has there been liability either on a child or a woman that went into a country that was supposed to have had UNESCO program there, and there was nobody in the community or in the public health looking out for them?
Why don't I take the second question and then respond to all of them together?
I just wanted to ask, since UNESCO doesn't officially have a stance on this or officially work on commercial sex, I was wondering if you could speak to some of the public health UN agencies like the WHO or UNFPA that do have kind of more extensive work on commercial sex and what their stance is.
Okay. Let me start with why the U.S. did not subscribe to the program. Actually, U.S. has just informed us a few weeks ago that they are withdrawing from UNESCO fully. So they are not going to be a member of UNESCO effective December 2018. It's according to the rules, they have to stay as a member for 1 year after they give official notification that they are not going to be part of UNESCO. Most of the opposition for comprehensive sexuality education came from conservative elements in the US, as you can guess. And the criticism was that with this comprehensive sexuality education, UNESCO was actually promoting promiscuity, early sexual activity, and different supporting different gender identities to be adopted by unsuspecting children. It's the same criticism that we hear in some other countries, but it's mostly because those people have not really read the document, don't really know what the program does, and it's a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the name of the program. To the best of my knowledge, we have not been sued, but we do get complaints to official letters of complaints from individuals, from organizations, which are discussed in a special group formed by the member states of UNESCO, and then official responses are sent to those groups with explanations about why the program or why the interpretation is not the real one. But we have not been sued. I don't know, I'm not sure that there's a mechanism to sue an international organization. But I'll look into that. Now, I have to admit I prepared for this more from the perspective of UNESCO, so I did not look at the official, first of all, whether there's an official position at the WHO or at the UNFPA on this specific topic. So I don't know, but I'll be happy to ask some of the colleagues I have in those organizations and get back to you. Thank you again, and apologies for overtime.
Thank you very much. So a quick announcement. I've just learned that I think Twitter is blocking any of the tweets about this event that have the word sex in them. So if you do want to tweet about the event, maybe try using a substitute word or just SX, and maybe we'll be able, say it again? Or an emoji, thank you, yeah. Please do. Oh, great, okay, so we're moving ahead, that's great. Good update. Yeah, so we're in the clear. You can tweet and write whatever you want. That's great. So we are now taking a very short break. So we have about 12 minutes. Please do come back because we will start promptly at 10:45, and you will not want to miss our next featured speaker. So please come back in just a few, and we'll see you at 10:45. Thank you.